That fence stays, Mr. Reed. Your property line is an opinion. The HOAs is a fact, and it's backed by our lawyers. The words hung in the humid afternoon air, thick and suffocating, like the woman who'd spoken them. Her name was Karen Brewer, and she was the president of the Creekwood Estates Homeowners Association, a title she wore like a monarch's crown. She stood there, a floral print muumuu stretched taut over her considerable frame, hands planted firmly on her hips, her face a mask of smug certainty. Behind her, a brand-new 6-foot-tall vinyl privacy fence gleamed in the Georgia sun, a stark white scar across the deep green of my land. It wasn't just a fence, it was a declaration of war. It sliced 30 feet deep into my property, cutting off the back third of my workshop and, most offensively, bisecting the ancient, sprawling water oak that my wife and I had loved so dearly. The fence posts were driven into the earth just inches from its trunk, a cruel girdle on a living monument. The financial sting was immediate. The thousands I'd spent just last year on a certified survey to confirm my boundaries before building that workshop now felt like money I'd set on fire. But the real loss was the violation, the sheer, arrogant audacity of it. This was my land, 5 acres of quiet solitude I'd bought after 20 years in the Army Corps of Engineers, a place to decompress and live out a peaceful life that my wife, Sarah, never got to see. Now this woman, this self-appointed queen of a subdivision I wasn't even a part of, had annexed a piece of it with vinyl and concrete. She saw my silence, my clenched jaw, and mistook it for weakness. "We sent you the courtesy notification," she added, her voice dripping with condescension. "When you failed to respond, the board approved the installation. It's for community security, a notification I'd never received. A community I didn't belong to, a fence that secured nothing but her own bloated sense of power." I looked past her, at the fence, at the shadow it cast over the grass Sarah and I had planned to turn into a garden. I saw the raw, splintered ends of the low retaining wall my own hands had built, now bulldozed to make way for their perfect, sterile line. The anger was a cold, hard knot in my stomach, but on the outside I was calm. The military taught me many things, but the most valuable was this: you don't engage the enemy on their terms, and you never ever attack without full reconnaissance. Karen Brewer had just declared war on a man who spent 2 decades drawing lines in the sand, both figuratively and very, very literally. She had no idea who I was, and she had no idea that I, Jack Reed, was the senior licensed surveyor for this very county. If you've ever dealt with a power-tripping HOA president who thinks the bylaws are scripture and they are the Messiah, hit that subscribe button and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. You won't believe how this ends, because this wasn't just about a fence. This was about a bully who picked the wrong fight with the one man who could dismantle her entire kingdom using nothing but a tripod, a GPS receiver, and her own rulebook. My story with this land began 5 years before Karen and her plastic kingdom ever broke ground. Sarah and I bought it as a foreclosure, a neglected patch of Georgia countryside with a rundown but solid brick house. It was our forever plan. She was an artist, a painter of landscapes, and I was a surveyor, a man of lines and angles. We saw the beauty in the property's raw structure, the gentle slope down to the creek, the towering pines, and the magnificent water oak that stood like a sentinel in the back acreage. We spent every weekend for 2 years clearing brush, mending the house, and falling more in love with the place and each other. Sarah would set up her easel under the oak while I worked on the house, and in the evenings we'd sit on the porch and watch the fireflies rise from the fields. She had sketches for everything: the garden we'd plant, the stone path to the creek, the workshop I would build for my woodworking hobby. Then cancer came like a thief in the night. It was fast and it was brutal. In 6 months she was gone, and my world was hollowed out. The property became my sanctuary and my prison. Every tree, every stone held a memory. For a year I just existed, going through the motions. But one morning I found her old sketchbook, and I knew I couldn't let our dream die with her. I had to build it. I started with the workshop. Before I poured a single bag of concrete, I did what I do best. I conducted a full boundary survey of my own property, a professional-grade, ironclad survey complete with recorded monuments and a plat map filed with the county clerk's office. I left nothing to chance. I built the workshop exactly where she'd sketched it, nestled in a clearing 50 feet from the back property line, with a wide double door facing the old oak. It became my therapy. The scent of sawdust, the hum of the lathe, the satisfaction of creating something tangible. It was the only thing that kept the grief at bay. Then came the bulldozers. A developer bought the 100 acres of farmland behind me, and Creekwood Estates was born. A sea of identical beige houses with manicured lawns and oppressive rules sprouted up, their property line running parallel to mine. I paid them little mind. My land was my own, a grandfathered parcel exempt from their HOA covenants. I was a quiet neighbor. I kept my grass cut, my property maintained, and my noise to a minimum. I had no interest in their cookie-cutter world, and I assumed they had no interest in my rustic one. That was my mistake. My mistake was underestimating the insatiable appetite of petty tyrants. Karen Brewer had been elected HOA president on a platform of protecting property values, which was her dog whistle for absolute conformity. My 5 acres of relative wilderness, my slightly too long grass, my unapologetically functional workshop, they were an affront to her vision of suburban perfection. The fence, I realized, wasn't about security. It was about control. It was about erasing the untidy line between her world and mine and imposing her will. She stood there, waiting for me to yell, to threaten, to give her the satisfaction of a fight. I gave her nothing. I simply took out my phone, took a series of slow, deliberate photos of her, the fence, and its position relative to my workshop and the oak tree. I recorded a short video panning from a known corner of my house to the fence line. Her smug smile faltered, replaced by a flicker of confusion. "What are you doing?" she demanded. I lowered the phone. "Documenting," I said, my voice even and low. "You'll be hearing from my lawyer." I turned and walked back to my house, the sound of her sputtering indignation fading behind me. The war had begun, but the first shots would not be fired with anger. They would be fired with certified mail, official records, and the cold, hard, undeniable mathematics of the law. I didn't storm inside and punch a wall. I didn't even call my lawyer right away. Instead, I made a fresh pot of coffee, sat down at my kitchen table, and spread out the blueprint of my own property survey. The paper was crisp, the lines precise. Every angle was calculated, every distance measured to the hundredth of a foot. It was a document of facts, of empirical truth. I looked at the northern boundary, the one that bordered Creekwood Estates. The line was straight as an arrow, marked at both ends by half-inch iron pins I had driven into the ground myself, their positions recorded with survey-grade GPS and cross-referenced with the original county monuments. There was no ambiguity. There was no room for interpretation. The fence, according to my quick visual assessment, was a full 30 feet south of that line. An encroachment of that magnitude wasn't a mistake, it was an invasion. My first move wasn't offensive, it was investigative. The next morning, I didn't go to my workshop. I went to my office at the county records building. The smell of old paper and microfilm was comforting, a scent of order and history. I greeted my colleagues and headed straight for the plat room. "Morning, Jack," said Eleanor, the county clerk, a woman who had been presiding over these records since before I was born. "What brings you to the archives? Don't you have enough of these at home?" I gave her a thin smile. "Just checking some new filings, Eleanor. A subdivision called Creekwood Estates." She nodded, her fingers flying across her keyboard. "Ah, yes, the Brewer woman's little fiefdom. We get calls about them all the time. Fines for the wrong shade of beige mailbox." She pulled up the file. "Here you go. Plat filed 6 months ago." I unrolled the large sheet of paper. It was a standard subdivision plat showing all the lots, roads, and common areas. I found the boundary line in question, and then I saw it. In the bottom right corner, in the certification block, was the surveyor's seal. I recognized the name immediately. Daniel Peterson, a young surveyor from a large engineering firm downtown. Peterson was known for being fast, not for being thorough. He was a plow boy, a guy who churned out subdivision plats as quickly as possible to maximize his firm's profit. But even a rush job had standards. I scanned the fine print, the notes and disclaimers that people like Karen never read. And there it was, a tiny note near the northern boundary. Existing iron pin, EIP, At NE corner not recovered. Boundary established from secondary evidence pending further investigation. My heart gave a little thump. He hadn't found the primary monument, the cornerstone of that entire section of the map. He had likely relied on old fence lines or aerial photos, which were notoriously unreliable. He'd made a professional guess and noted it on the plat, covering himself legally, but an HOA, in its rush to build a fence, would see a line on a map and treat it as gospel. They hadn't done their due diligence. Karen hadn't done hers. She had built a 1,000-foot-long, $20,000 fence based on a documented guess. This was better than I'd hoped. It wasn't just my word against hers. It was her own surveyor's professional doubt against her arrogant certainty. I made a high-resolution, certified copy of the plat map. Back at my desk, I drafted a letter. It wasn't an angry rant. It was a cold, professional instrument of pain. I laid out the facts in simple, numbered points. 1. I am the owner of Parcel 7B. 2. Your fence, installed on or about June 15th, encroaches upon my property by approximately 30 feet. 3. This constitutes trespass and property damage. 4. I have attached a copy of my certified boundary survey filed with the county. 5. I have also attached a copy of your own subdivision plat, which explicitly notes that the boundary in question was not verified by a primary monument. 6. You have 7 days to provide a written plan for the complete removal of the fence and the restoration of my property. Failure to do so will result in legal action seeking damages, legal fees, and a court order for the fence's removal. I printed it on heavy bond paper, sealed it in a business envelope, and drove to Karen's house. She lived in the biggest model, a 2-story beige monstrosity with a 3-car garage and an aggressively green lawn. She answered the door in a different, equally garish moo-moo, holding a small, yapping dog that looked as miserable as she made everyone else feel. I handed her the envelope. "This is a formal notice regarding the fence, Miss Brewer." She took it, her eyes narrowing. She tore it open right there in the doorway, her eyes scanning the page. I watched her expression shift from smugness to a flicker of confusion, then to pure, unadulterated rage. She wasn't angry because she was wrong. She was angry because I had dared to challenge her authority with something as inconvenient as facts. "This is ridiculous," she scoffed, waving the letter. "Our lawyers approved this. This is just your little drawing. That little drawing, Ms. Brewer, is a legal document filed with the county, as is yours, which, as I pointed out, contains a note from your own surveyor questioning the very line you build on." She looked at the letter again, then back at me. A slow, cruel smile spread across her face, and then she did something I hadn't anticipated. She ripped the letter in half, then in quarters, and let the pieces flutter to her manicured porch. "Your notice is noted," she said, her voice dripping with venom. "And here's one for you." She stepped back inside for a moment and returned with a different envelope, shoving it into my chest. "That's a fine for unapproved landscaping on HOA common property. Your little retaining wall, $100. It'll be $50 a day until you remove the rest of it. Have a nice day, Mr. Reed." She slammed the door in my face. The little dog yapped furiously from inside. I stood there for a moment, the pieces of my carefully crafted letter at my feet and her ridiculous fine in my hand. My calm, professional approach had failed. She had escalated. She had torn up a map and declared it her territory. Fine. If she wanted to play dirty, I could do more than just draw the lines. I could enforce them. The drive back to my house was a study in controlled fury. Ripping up the letter was one thing, a theatrical, childish display of dominance. But issuing me a fine for a wall on my own land that she was illegally occupying? That was a calculated act of bureaucratic warfare. She wasn't just trespassing. She was now attempting to extort me using the illegitimate authority of her office. She was trying to legitimize her land grab by treating me as a subservient member of her association. It was a classic bully tactic, and it was the single biggest mistake she could have made. It was the moment she turned a property dispute into a case of malicious prosecution. I walked into my house and immediately called Dave Miller. Dave had been my JAG officer back in the Corps, a sharp, no-nonsense lawyer who left the Army to fight for veterans and landowners against corporations and overreaching governments. We'd been through hell and back in places I couldn't talk about, and I trusted him implicitly. "Jack," he answered, his voice a familiar baritone, "don't tell me you finally decided to retire and take up golf." "Worse," I said. "I've got an HOA problem." I explained the entire situation, from the fence to the torn-up letter to the absurd fine. I could almost hear him grinning through the phone. "Oh, this is beautiful, Jack. This is textbook, an unverified boundary, a clear trespass, and now she's issuing fines against a non-member? It's a legal hat trick of stupidity." "So what's the play, Dave?" I asked. "Do we file suit tomorrow?" "No," he said, and his voice turned serious. "No, we let her dig. We let her pour the concrete around her ankles. A lawsuit right now is a he said, she said property dispute. It'll drag on for months. But if we let her escalate, if we document every idiotic, illegal step she takes, we turn it into something else. We build a case not just for trespass, but for harassment, for abuse of power. We don't just want the fence moved, Jack. We want to make sure she pays for every single inch of it, personally." His advice was sound. It appealed to my surveyor's soul. You don't just find one point of reference, you establish a baseline. You gather multiple data points until the conclusion is irrefutable. "So I should just pay the fine?" I asked, the thought galling me. "Hell no," Dave laughed. "You ignore it. You ignore everything. You don't speak to her. You don't write to her. You become a ghost. Let her send more letters. Let her tack on daily fines. Let her threaten to put a lien on your property. Every piece of paper she sends you is another nail for her own coffin. We want a mountain of evidence showing a pattern of harassment based on a false premise." While Karen was busy building her paper prison, I would build my alliance. I knew I couldn't be the only one on the receiving end of her tyranny. That evening, I took a walk. I didn't head into Creekwood Estates. I walked along the outside, along the boundary line that connected my property to my other neighbors, the ones who, like me, were not part of the HOA. My first stop was Mrs. Gable's house. She was in her 80s, a widow who had lived on her 10 acres for half a century. Her property bordered the HOA on their western side. I found her tending her roses, her back bent with age but her hands still deft. "Mrs. Gable," I began, "I'm Jack Reed, your neighbor to the east." She smiled warmly. "I know who you are, dear. I see you out in your workshop. You do beautiful work. I'm afraid I'm here about a less pleasant matter," I said, and gestured vaguely toward the new subdivision. "The HOA." Her smile vanished. "That woman," she said, her voice turning to steel. "Karen Brewer." It turned out Mrs. Gable had received 3 separate fines in the last month. One was for a bird feeder that was attracting undesirable wildlife, which apparently included blue jays and cardinals. Another was for a compost pile that was visible from one of the HOA's walking trails, a trail that ran right along her property line. The third and most ridiculous was because the paint on her garden shed was not an approved earth tone. She was a feisty woman, but the constant stream of certified letters and threats of liens had worn her down. She felt helpless. I spoke to 2 other families that evening. The Millers, a young couple with 3 kids, had been cited because their children's treehouse, built 20 years before the HOA existed, was now deemed a hazardous, unapproved structure. The Patels, who ran a small organic farm, were being harassed about the smell of their chickens. The pattern was clear. Karen wasn't just protecting property values. She was on a crusade to sanitize the world around her, to extend her dominion beyond the legal boundaries of her subdivision. She was using the HOA's legal fund as a war chest to bully and intimidate anyone who didn't conform to her sterile aesthetic. I told each of them the same thing. Don't respond. Don't pay. Document everything. Get a file. Keep every letter, every envelope. Note the dates you received them. And if you're willing, let me have copies. By the end of the night, I had the beginnings of a file that showed Karen Brewer wasn't just in a dispute with me over a fence. She was engaged in a systematic campaign of harassment against multiple elderly and working-class residents. My personal fight was about to become a community one. My final step for the night was to set my own trap. Under the cover of darkness, I took my surveying gear out to the real property line. I didn't put up stakes or flags. That would be too obvious. Instead, I used my equipment to locate the exact positions where the original half-inch iron pins should be. I found the one on my western corner, buried under 6 inches of dirt and pine straw, exactly where it was supposed to be. The eastern one, the one her surveyor couldn't find, took more work. But I had the original survey notes from the 1950s, referencing 2 old oak trees as witness corners. One tree was gone, but the other remained. Using that tree as my reference, I calculated the exact spot. My metal detector screamed. 2 feet down, beneath layers of silt and clay from the new construction runoff, I found it. The original, rusted, but beautifully solid iron monument. I didn't disturb it. I just cleared the dirt around it and took a dozen high-resolution, geotagged photos. Then using these 2 verified points, I drove small, almost invisible steel spikes, the kind used for concrete forming, every 50 feet along the true line. They were nearly flush with the ground, hidden in the grass. They were my data points, my hidden truth. The stage was set. Karen thought she was playing checkers. She had no idea I was setting up a chessboard. The next 2 weeks were a masterclass in psychological warfare, with me as the silent observer and Karen as the increasingly frantic aggressor. Just as Dave predicted, my silence drove her mad. The first certified letter arrived a week after our confrontation. It was a final notice regarding the $100 fine for my retaining wall, now inflated with late fees to $350. It threatened to place a lien on my property if not paid within 10 business days. I photographed it, logged it, and filed it away. 4 days later, another certified letter. This one was even more audacious. It was a formal demand that I remove the unauthorized secondary structure from the HOA common area buffer zone. It took me a moment to realize they were talking about my workshop. The 30-foot encroachment had swallowed the entire back portion of the building, including the main double doors I used to move lumber and equipment. According to Karen's new reality, my own workshop was now trespassing on her land. The letter stated I had 30 days to dismantle and remove the offending structure, or the HOA would hire a contractor to remove it at my expense, a cost they estimated at over $10,000, which would, of course, be added to the lien against my property. This was the escalation Dave had been waiting for. This was no longer a fine for a garden wall. This was a direct threat to destroy my property, a building I had built with my own hands in my wife's memory. The cold anger I'd been suppressing began to harden into something sharper, more focused. I forwarded a copy to Dave, whose only reply was a single, gleeful word: perfect. Karen wasn't content with just paper threats. She needed an audience. The Creekwood Estates monthly HOA meeting was her stage, and she was the star of the show. I obviously wasn't invited, but my new network of disgruntled neighbors had ears everywhere. Mrs. Gable's niece, who lived in the subdivision, attended the meeting and gave me a full report the next day. According to her, Karen spent the first 20 minutes of the meeting painting herself as a crusader for community safety and order. She spoke of the new security fence and how it was protecting their children from the unpredictable elements of the rural properties bordering their pristine neighborhood. Then she launched into a full-blown character assassination of me. She never used my name, referring to me only as the uncooperative landowner to the north. She described me as a stubborn old recluse who refused to see reason, a man who was single-handedly holding back the community's progress. She announced to a smattering of applause from her loyalists the successful acquisition of a 30-foot security buffer, which would soon be landscaped into a beautiful walking path for residents. She spun the story of my workshop not as a threat to destroy private property, but as the necessary removal of an abandoned, dilapidated shed to make way for this new community amenity. She was lying masterfully to her own people, painting me as the villain to justify her illegal actions, but she overplayed her hand. At the end of her speech, a young man stood up. His name was Mark, an engineer who had just moved into the neighborhood a few months prior. He was sharp, logical, and not easily swayed by dramatic speeches. "Karen," he said, his voice calm and clear, cutting through the self-congratulatory atmosphere. "I have a question about this buffer zone. 30 feet is a significant amount of land. Could you please show us the survey the board used to authorize the fence placement? And I'd also like to see the minutes from the board meeting where the vote was taken to spend HOA funds on legal action against this landowner. I'm just concerned about the potential liability here." The room fell silent. You could hear a pin drop. Karen, who was used to adulation and obedience, was visibly flustered. She stammered, her face turning a blotchy red. Well, the survey it's a legal document. It's with our attorneys for the ongoing proceedings. And the board vote? Mark pressed gently. It was an emergency action, Karen snapped, her composure cracking. As president, I have the authority to act in the best interests of the community's security. It was a unanimous verbal agreement. Mark just nodded slowly and sat down. But the damage was done. He hadn't accused her of anything, but he had planted a powerful seed of doubt in the minds of every thinking person in that room. An engineer asking about surveys and meeting minutes was a red flag they couldn't ignore. The next day, I got a call from an unknown number. It was Mark. He'd gotten my number from Mrs. Gable's niece. Mr. Reed, he said, I'm not sure what's going on, but I was at the HOA meeting last night, and something doesn't smell right. I'm an engineer. I deal with surveys and contracts every day. The way she avoided my questions was troubling. If you need someone on the inside, someone to get you copies of documents or just to be a witness, I'm your guy. I don't like bullies. The alliance was growing. I now had eyes and ears on the inside. Karen thought she was isolating me, but her own arrogance was uniting a silent coalition against her. She was building the very community she claimed to be protecting, a community of people tired of her tyranny, a community that was about to rally behind me. My ghost-like silence was working on the outside, and Mark's quiet logic was working on the inside. Karen was being squeezed from both directions, and she didn't even know it. She was so focused on her imaginary enemy that she couldn't see the real threat gathering all around her. With Mark as an inside source and the threat against my workshop as legal justification, Dave Miller decided it was time to move from defense to offense. We weren't filing a lawsuit yet. We were initiating the discovery phase before a suit was even on the table. Dave drafted a formidable-looking document titled Formal Request for Document Production Pursuant to Pending Litigation. It was a legal broadside, a demand for every scrap of paper related to the fence and the dispute. We requested the survey Karen had used, all communications with the surveyor, the contract and invoices from the fence company, the minutes from every board meeting where the fence or my property was discussed, and all correspondence, including emails and text messages, between Karen and the other board members regarding the matter. It was a legally binding request. Ignoring it would have serious consequences in court. Karen couldn't just rip this one up. She had to forward it to the HOA's lawyer, a man from a downtown firm who likely billed by the hour and had no idea what a hornet's nest his client had kicked. About a week later, a thick package arrived at Dave's office. It was the HOA's response. Their lawyer had employed a classic tactic known as the document dump. He had sent us hundreds of pages of unsorted, unindexed paperwork, hoping we'd either miss the important details or give up trying to find them. They had sent email printouts, invoices, meeting agendas, and miscellaneous memos, all mixed together in a chaotic pile. It would have been an intimidating mess for most people. But for me, it was like coming home. Sorting through chaotic data to find the one critical point of truth was what I did for a living. I spent an entire Saturday at Dave's conference table, a pot of coffee brewing, as I meticulously sorted the mountain of paper into chronological and categorical order. And the story it told was even more damning than I had imagined. The first thing I found was the invoice from Daniel Peterson's surveying firm. It was for a preliminary boundary stakeout, not a certified survey. The cost was low, far too low for a proper verification of a mile-long boundary line. Attached to it was a copy of the very plat map I had pulled from the county records, the one with the disclaimer about the unrecovered monument. Then I found the email chain. It was the smoking gun. The first email was from Peterson to Karen. It read, Karen, we've completed the preliminary stakeout for the fence. As we discussed, we were unable to locate the northeast monument pin on the Reed property. Our line is based on the old fence line shown in the 2005 aerials. I strongly recommend a full boundary survey and monument recovery before you proceed with any permanent construction. Let me know how you'd like to proceed. Karen's reply, sent just 10 minutes later, was breathtaking in its arrogance. Daniel, thank you. There is no need for further investigation. The line you have staked is perfectly adequate, and reflects the board's intentions. Please send your final invoice. She had been explicitly warned in writing by her own expert. She had ignored his professional advice and willfully proceeded on a known uncertainty because it suited her intentions. She hadn't made a mistake. She had made a deliberate choice to cut corners and ignore the facts. But the treasure trove didn't stop there. I found the minutes from the HOA board meetings. As Mark suspected, there was no formal vote to approve the fence's location or the budget. There was a single line item in one meeting's agenda: North Perimeter Security Fence Update, K. Brewer. The minutes for that item simply said, President Brewer provided an update on the progress of the security fence, project moving forward as planned. The other two board members, a timid treasurer named Arthur and a secretary named Brenda who seemed to just rubber stamp everything Karen did, had never been asked to vote on the specifics. Karen had used her position to ram the project through without proper oversight, a clear violation of the HOA's own bylaws regarding expenditures over $5,000. She had lied to the residents at the community meeting, claiming she had the board's approval. The final piece of the puzzle was the contract with the fence company. In the section defining the scope of work, the contract stated that the HOA is responsible for the accuracy of the marked fence line. Contractor assumes no liability for placement disputes. Karen had signed it. She had single-handedly assumed all liability for the fence's location on behalf of the entire HOA. I sat back in my chair, the documents laid out on the table like evidence in a murder trial. We had it all: willful negligence in ignoring her surveyor's advice, violation of HOA bylaws by acting without a board vote, misrepresentation of the facts to the homeowners, and a signed contract accepting full liability. Dave walked in with 2 cups of coffee. He looked at the organized piles on the table and then at the grin on my face. "Find what you were looking for?" he asked. "Dave," I said, holding up the email from Peterson, "we didn't just find a smoking gun. We found the bullet, the casing, and a signed confession." He read the email, and a slow, wicked smile spread across his face. "Oh, Karen," he said to the empty room, "you are going to pay for a very nice vacation for Mr. Reed." The paperwork war was over. We had won. Now it was time for the public execution. The time for subtlety was over. The time for ghosts and shadows had passed. It was time to bring the truth into the sunlight, literally. The next Monday, I didn't go to my usual desk at the county office. I went to the permitting department. I walked in not as Jack Reed, the aggrieved landowner, but as J.D. Reed, county surveyor. License number 2743. I filed an official work order for a boundary line clarification and monument restoration for the line between Parcel 7B and the Creekwood Estates common area. Because it involved a dispute that could potentially lead to litigation, it was flagged as a priority job. I assigned it to myself. I scheduled the work for 10 a.m. the following Saturday. I wanted an audience. I wanted every resident of Creekwood Estates who was out mowing their lawn or washing their car to see what was happening. I wanted Karen Brewer to have to face the truth not in a private letter or a lawyer's office, but in front of the very people she claimed to be protecting. Saturday morning dawned bright and clear, a perfect day for a public reckoning. At 9:45 a.m., I pulled up not in my personal pickup truck, but in my official county-issued vehicle. It was a big Ford F-250, gleaming white, with the official seal of the county on both doors. I was wearing my high-visibility yellow vest with County Surveyor printed in big block letters on the back. My 2-man crew, Tom and a young apprentice named Chris, pulled up behind me in a similar truck, carrying the tools of our trade: a robotic total station, a GPS rover, tripods, prism poles, and a magnetic locator. The effect was immediate. The sight of 2 official county trucks and 3 men in professional gear setting up sophisticated equipment right next to the brand new fence was like a scene from a movie. People started drifting out of their houses. A man washing his minivan paused, hose in hand. A woman tending her flower bed stood up, wiping her brow. The whispers started, and cell phones began to appear. We began our work with deliberate, methodical precision. We set up the total station on a control point I had previously established, its electronic eye whirring as it took its measurements. Tom and Chris set up a backsite, and we began the process of laying out the true boundary line. the one defined by the iron pins I had uncovered. It didn't take long for the queen to emerge from her castle. Karen Brewer came storming down the slight incline from her house, her face a thundercloud of fury. She was wearing pink sweatpants and a t-shirt that said "Yoga Mom," which was a spectacular display of irony. "What is the meaning of this?" she screeched, her voice shrill enough to startle birds from the trees. "This is private HOA property. You are trespassing. I am calling the police." I turned to face her, my expression calm and professional. I had been waiting for this moment. I reached into my vest and pulled out the official stamped work order. I held it out for her. "Ma'am," I said, my voice intentionally loud enough for the growing crowd of neighbors to hear. "My name is Jack Reed. I'm a licensed surveyor with the Forsyth County Surveyor's Office. This is an official county vehicle, and this is an official county work order to clarify the recorded boundary line between private parcel 7B and the Creekwood Estates common area." I pointed to the plat book and page number on the form. "This action is being taken in accordance with state law to resolve a documented boundary dispute. We are not trespassing. We are operating in the public right-of-way and under the authority of the county." Her jaw worked silently for a moment. She was completely wrong-footed. She had prepared for a fight with a stubborn old man, not a confrontation with a government official who was quoting statutes at her. She snatched the work order from my hand, her eyes scanning it frantically, looking for a loophole. Behind her, I could see Mark, the engineer, standing on his lawn, watching with a small, satisfied smile. He gave me a subtle nod. This is harassment," she finally sputtered. "You're just doing this to intimidate me because of our disagreement." "Ma'am," I said, my voice still level, "I'm doing this because the official plat map, the one your own HOA filed, indicates a potential discrepancy at this location. My job is to find the truth. The physical evidence on the ground determines the line, not our disagreements." And with that, I turned my back on her and went back to my work. "Tom, let's locate that monument." Tom powered up the magnetic locator, a long pole with a circular sensor at the end. He swept it over the area where I knew the eastern pin was buried. The locator began to whine, the pitch rising to a high-pitched squeal as he zeroed in on the spot. Chris was ready with a shovel. The small crowd of about 20 residents was now completely silent, watching the unfolding drama with rapt attention. This was better than reality TV. Chris dug carefully, scraping away the layers of dirt and construction debris. And then, with a metallic clink, his shovel hit something solid. He cleared the remaining dirt with his hands, revealing the rusted, unmistakable top of a half-inch iron pin. The original survey monument, the physical, legally recognized cornerstone of the entire property line, sitting there, exactly where it had been for 70 years. A quiet gasp went through the crowd. I turned to Karen, who looked as if she'd just seen a ghost. "There it is, Ms. Brewer," I said, my voice carrying across the lawn. "That is the boundary." The pin was a full 30 feet away from her gleaming white fence, 30 feet on my side. The truth was out of the ground, and there was nowhere left for her to hide. The silence that followed the discovery of the iron pin was heavy and profound. It was the sound of a lie dying. The crowd of neighbors stared, first at the rusted piece of metal in the ground, then at the stark white fence standing so ridiculously far inside the true boundary, and finally at Karen Brewer. Her face, which had been a mask of righteous fury, was now a crumbling facade of disbelief and panic. The color drained from her cheeks, leaving her looking pale and suddenly much older. She stared at the pin as if it were a snake that had just bitten her. All her bluster, all her threats, all her self-assured authority had been annihilated by a single piece of buried steel. My crew and I didn't pause to let the moment linger. The job wasn't finished. "All right, Chris," I said, my voice cutting through the quiet. "Let's mark it out. Orange paint, every 10 feet. Let's make it nice and clear for everyone." Chris grabbed a can of Surveyor's marking paint and, using the total station for perfect alignment between the two corner monuments, began walking the line. With each press of the nozzle, a bright orange slash appeared on the grass, a dotted line of irrefutable truth stretching from one end of the property to the other. Psst, a dash of orange. Psst, another. Each one landed with the finality of a judge's gavel. The line he painted ran through what the HOA had for a month considered their common area. It ran past the spot where they had planned their new walking path. It ran directly through the middle of two freshly planted crepe myrtle trees. And most importantly, it confirmed that my workshop, my retaining wall, and my beloved water oak were not just on my property, but comfortably and completely within my property, with a 30-foot buffer to spare. The visual was devastatingly effective. No one could argue with it. No one could misinterpret it. The fence was, without a shadow of a doubt, in the wrong place. This can't be right, Karen stammered, her voice a desperate whisper. Our surveyor, our plans. Your surveyor, Ms. Brewer, I said, turning to face her fully, noted on his own plat map that he couldn't find this monument and that his line was preliminary. You chose to ignore his professional warning. Your plans were based on a guess, and you guessed wrong. From my field bag, I pulled another document. This one had been prepared by Dave. It was crisp, clean, and terrifyingly official. I handed it to her. This is a formal legal demand, Ms. Brewer. It outlines your liability in this matter. It demands the immediate removal of the fence from my property, at the HOA's expense, within 14 days. It demands full reimbursement for all my legal fees to date. It demands monetary damages for the loss of use of my property, the damage to my land, and the harassment I and other neighbors have endured. And finally, it demands a full, written retraction and apology to be mailed to every single member of the Creekwood Estates HOA, clarifying that your previous statements about me and my property were false. She held the paper, her hand trembling. She was no longer a queen in her castle. She was just a woman standing on a lawn, exposed as a fool and a liar in front of her entire neighborhood. The residents were no longer just watching. They were talking amongst themselves, their voices a low, angry buzz. I could hear snippets of their conversations. A special assessment for this? She told us it was all approved. Lied to us at the meeting. Mark, the engineer, stepped forward. He wasn't addressing me. He was addressing his neighbors. I think we need to call an emergency board meeting, he said, his voice ringing with authority. I think we, the homeowners, deserve a full explanation of how our money was spent on a project based on an unverified preliminary guess. Another homeowner, a woman I didn't know, chimed in, her voice sharp with anger. I want to know how much of our money is going to be spent fixing this. My dues just went up 10%. The tide had not just turned, it had become a tsunami, and it was crashing down directly on Karen Brewer. She looked around, her eyes wide with desperation, searching for an ally, for someone to defend her. But there was no one. The other two board members, Arthur and Brenda, had come outside to see what the commotion was about. They stood frozen on the edge of the crowd, their faces aghast, looking like cornered mice. They clearly had no idea of the legal minefield Karen had marched the entire community into. Karen's last shred of defiance kicked in. She turned on me, her face contorted in a snarl. You'll be hearing from our lawyer, she shrieked. You can't do this. I simply pointed to the bright orange line on the grass. Ma'am, I said, my voice cold and final. I didn't do this. You did. The truth was right here, buried under your feet, the entire time. All you had to do was look for it. I turned back to my crew. Let's pack it up, boys. Our work here is done. We began breaking down our equipment, the professional, practiced movements, a stark contrast to the chaos and anger erupting among the homeowners. Karen was surrounded, fielding angry questions from a dozen different directions. Her kingdom was collapsing, and the irony was, she had handed me the shovel to dig up the evidence that would bring it all down. The emergency HOA board meeting was held 2 nights later in the community clubhouse. It was less of a meeting and more of a public spectacle. The room was packed far beyond its legal capacity, with homeowners standing along the walls and spilling out into the hallway. The atmosphere was electric with anger and betrayal. Dave and I were not there, on his advice. Let the piranhas eat their own, he'd said. Our presence would just make you the issue. Right now, Karen is the issue. Let them deal with her. Mark, however, was there, and he had come prepared. He had spoken to Dave and me at length, and we had armed him with copies of all the key documents, Karen's email exchange with the surveyor, the meeting minutes showing no official vote, the contract where she assumed all liability, and the legal demand letter I had served her. The meeting was a complete implosion of Karen Brewer's authority. The other two board members, Arthur and Brenda, started by trying to deflect, claiming they weren't fully aware of the details. But Mark was relentless. He stood up, calm and methodical, and presented the evidence, piece by piece, on an overhead projector for everyone to see. He showed them the surveyor's email, highlighting the explicit warning Karen had ignored. A wave of groans and angry murmurs swept through the room. He showed them the meeting minutes, proving that no vote had ever taken place, meaning the expenditure for the fence and the subsequent legal threats were a violation of their own governing documents. He showed them the contract, pointing out the clause where Karen had single-handedly accepted all liability on their behalf. Finally, he put up a summary of my legal demands, showing them the estimated cost to remove the fence, pay my damages and legal fees, and the potential for a much larger lawsuit if they failed to comply. He explained that this would almost certainly require a hefty special assessment, a one-time fee charged to every single homeowner to cover the costs of Karen's recklessness. That's when the room erupted. The homeowners who paid their dues and trusted their board to act responsibly realized they were now on the hook financially for one person's ego trip. People were shouting, demanding answers. "How could you let this happen, Karen? You lied to us. We're going to have to pay for your mistake?" Karen tried to defend herself, but her arguments were weak and pathetic. She blamed the surveyor for not being clearer. She blamed the fence company for not double-checking. She even tried to blame me again, claiming I had been deliberately obtuse and had set a trap for her. With every excuse, she dug her hole deeper. The crowd wasn't buying it. They had seen the documents. They had seen the orange line on the grass. They knew exactly who was at fault. Finally, a motion was made from the floor by a retired accountant. I moved for an immediate vote of no confidence in Karen Brewer as president of this board, and for her removal from the board, effective immediately. The motion was seconded by a dozen voices at once. A vote was taken by a show of hands. It was nearly unanimous. In a humiliating public spectacle, Karen Brewer was stripped of her title and her power. The timid treasurer, Arthur, was made the acting president, and Mark was nominated and overwhelmingly voted in to fill the newly vacant board seat. The old regime was over. The first official act of the new board, passed unanimously that very night, was to accept all the terms of my legal demand. The next morning I received a call from Arthur. His voice was shaky and apologetic. "Mr. Reed," he began, "on behalf of the Creekwood Estates HOA, I want to offer our most sincere and profound apologies. There is no excuse for what happened. We have accepted all the terms in your lawyer's letter. We will have a crew out to remove the fence next week, and a check for the full amount of the damages and your legal fees will be delivered to your lawyer by the end of the day." He sounded exhausted, but also relieved. The reign of terror was over. I was gracious in my response. "Thank you, Arthur. I appreciate the call. Let's just get this resolved and move on as good neighbors." There was no need to rub salt in the wound. The system, however flawed, had ultimately worked. The truth had come out, and the person responsible had been held accountable by her own community. I had won, not just for myself, but for Mrs. Gable and the Millers and the Patels. I had proven that a bully's power, no matter how entrenched, is no match for the simple, unassailable truth. A few days later, a rumor circulated through the neighborhood that a for sale sign had gone up in front of Karen Brewer's house. She couldn't face the community she had tried to rule. Her public humiliation was complete. She had not only lost the battle, but she had lost her kingdom as well. The day the fence came down was a beautiful sunny Tuesday. I took the day off work. I sat on my back porch in the rocking chair Sarah had loved, with a steaming mug of coffee in my hands. It felt like a holiday. The same company that had installed the fence with such confident efficiency just a few weeks ago was now back to dismantle it with a quiet, almost sheepish demeanor. The work crew, a group of young, hard-working guys, seemed to understand the situation. One of them, the foreman, even walked over to my porch before they started. "Morning, sir," he said, taking off his hat. "Just wanted to say, we're sorry about all this. We just build where they tell us to." "I know, son," I said. "It's not your fault. Just be careful around that oak tree." He nodded earnestly. Yes, sir, we will. And they were. They worked with a surgeon's care, dismantling the sections of fence piece by piece. The rhythmic clang of the posts being pulled from their concrete footings was the most satisfying music I had ever heard. Neighbors from my side of the line stopped by throughout the day. Mrs. Gable brought over a still warm apple pie. For our champion, she said, her eyes twinkling. The Millers came by with their kids, who presented me with a crayon drawing of a man knocking down a fence. The Patels dropped off a dozen fresh eggs. It wasn't a celebration of revenge. It was a quiet, grateful acknowledgement of restored peace. A community that had been fractured by intimidation was now healing. The most symbolic moment came in the early afternoon when they reached the section of fence that had imprisoned my water oak. The workers carefully unbolted the vinyl panels and gently pried the posts from the ground near its ancient roots. As the last section was carried away, the tree seemed to breathe a sigh of relief, its full, magnificent canopy once again whole and unobstructed. It stood free, a silent, living testament to endurance. A piece of my wife's memory, a piece of our dream had been liberated. I felt a lump form in my throat, a mixture of sorrow for her absence and a profound sense of peace. I had protected this place for her. By late afternoon, it was all gone. All that remained were the disturbed patches of earth where the posts had been, a temporary scar that would soon heal. The 30-foot swath of my land was mine again. The view from my workshop door was open and clear. It was over. The following week, the new acting HOA president, Arthur, and the newly elected board member, Mark, asked to meet with me. We met at my kitchen table. They came bearing two things: a certified check for the full settlement amount and a copy of the letter of apology and retraction that had been mailed to every single resident of Creekwood Estates. The letter was a masterpiece of groveling. It detailed the board's gross mismanagement under the previous president, admitted the fence was built on a false and unverified boundary line, and formally apologized for the unwarranted harassment and financial burden placed upon me. It was a complete and total vindication. We also wanted to discuss the boundary, Arthur said nervously. We'd like to put up a new fence, on the correct line this time, of course, and we would like to hire you, professionally, to survey and stake it out for us, to ensure it's done right. I considered it for a moment. Then I shook my head. I don't think a fence is the answer, I said. Fences create division. We've had enough of that. How about we try something different? I walked them out to the back of my property, to the newly cleared land. The settlement you paid me is more than enough to cover my legal fees and the damages, I said. I'm going to use the rest of it to do something for both of us. I pointed along the bright orange line still faintly visible on the grass. Right here on the true property line, I'm going to plant a row of trees. Maple trees. They'll grow tall and beautiful. In the summer, they'll provide shade. In the fall, they'll be a blaze of color. They'll mark the boundary not with vinyl and concrete, but with something alive, a living fence that we can both enjoy. Arthur and Mark were speechless. They looked at each other, then back at me. Mr. Reed, Mark said, a look of genuine admiration on his face. That's an incredibly generous offer. It's not generous, I replied. It's just being a good neighbor. It's time we started acting like it. My victory wasn't just in tearing down a fence. It was in the opportunity to build something better in its place. The final chapter of this saga wasn't one of conflict, but of quiet restoration. The check from the HOA cleared without issue. True to my word, I paid Dave's invoice, which was smaller than I expected. He gave me a veteran's discount, he said, and then I called a local nursery. I ordered 25 mature red sunset maple trees, known for their brilliant autumn foliage. Planting them became my new project, my new therapy. I spent the next few weekends digging, planting, and mulching, carefully placing each tree directly on the surveyed property line. It was hard work, but it was joyful work. As I worked, people from Creekwood Estates would walk by on the path on their side and stop to talk. They were no longer wary or suspicious. They were friendly, curious, and deeply appreciative. They'd ask about the trees, about my workshop, about my time in the service. The invisible wall that Karen had tried to make real with vinyl was being replaced by handshakes and conversations over the nascent property line. Mark often came over to help, bringing his two young sons with him. They helped me haul mulch and water the new saplings. I found myself teaching them about trees, about tools, about the importance of measuring twice and cutting once. I was no longer the uncooperative landowner. I was Jack, the neighbor with the cool workshop. The community had started to mend. The HOA, under its new leadership, underwent a radical transformation. They held town halls to get resident input. They rewrote the bylaws to include checks and balances, ensuring no future president could wield dictatorial power. They rescinded all the ridiculous fines Karen had levied against Mrs. Gable and the other non-HOA residents, sending each of them formal letters of apology. They became what an HOA is supposed to be, an organization for the benefit of the community, not a weapon for the ego of one person. 6 months later, I attended one of their monthly meetings, this time as an invited and honored guest. They gave me a small plaque and a public thank you for my patience and integrity. In my short speech, I didn't mention Karen or the fence. I talked about boundaries. Good boundaries make good neighbors, I said. But those boundaries don't have to be walls. They can be lines of mutual respect. They can be an understanding of where one person's rights end and another's begin. You all have helped reestablish that respect here, and I thank you for it. Life settled into a new, more peaceful rhythm. The maple trees took root and began to thrive. My workshop was once again my sanctuary, its wide doors open to the afternoon sun, the view no longer obstructed by a white plastic wall, but framed by the promise of future shade and color. I finished the rocking horse I had been building and gave it to Mark's youngest son for his birthday. I helped Mrs. Gable repair the roof on her garden shed, the one with the unapproved paint color. Sometimes I would sit on my porch in the evening, watching the fireflies rise, and I would think about Sarah. I think she would have been proud. I had not only protected the home we dreamed of, but I had fought a battle the way she would have wanted. Not with anger and hate, but with truth, principle, and a stubborn refusal to let a bully win. The victory wasn't loud or explosive. It was the quiet satisfaction of a well-drawn line. It was the rustle of new leaves on young trees. It was the sound of children's laughter from the other side of a boundary that was no longer a barrier, but simply a place where two different worlds met in peace. I had faced down an enemy who weaponized rules and regulations, and I had defeated her with a better understanding of the rules, with more precise data, and with an unwavering belief in the simple empirical truth. Karen Brewer had thought my property line was just an opinion. I had proven, with the full authority of the law and the unyielding logic of mathematics, that it was a fact. And in this small corner of the world, facts, integrity, and good neighbors had won the day. The satisfaction was quiet, profound, and it was deeply, deeply earned.